Picture this, it's 431 BC, and the Greek world is about to descend into chaos. Two superpowers, Athens and Sparta, are about to fight a war that'll last nearly 3 decades and basically destroy everything that made ancient Greece great. You know what's wild? This wasn't some foreign invasion or barbarian threat. This was Greeks fighting Greeks, neighbor against neighbor, in what became one of the most brutal and tragic conflicts in ancient history. I'm going to walk you through this whole mess today, and trust me, it's got everything: political intrigue, plague, betrayal, dramatic battles at sea, and one of the most disastrous military expeditions ever. By the end, you'll see why people still study this war today, over 2,400 years later. So first, we need to understand who these two sides actually were, because Athens and Sparta couldn't have been more different if they tried. Athens was this thriving democracy, the cultural capital of the Greek world. We're talking philosophy, theater, art, architecture. The Parthenon was literally being finished right before this war started. Sparta, on the other hand, was basically a military state. From the time Spartan boys were 7 years old, they were taken from their families and trained to be warriors. That's it. That was their whole society. They didn't care about fancy buildings or philosophical debates. They had the most feared land army in Greece, maybe the world. Other cities would literally surrender just hearing that Spartan soldiers were marching their way. These two had actually been allies about 50 years earlier when they teamed up to fight off the Persians. You might have heard of battles like Marathon or Thermopylae with the 300 Spartans. But after they won, things got complicated fast. Athens took control of something called the Delian League, which was supposed to be a defensive alliance, but Athens basically turned it into their own empire. They collected tribute from other cities, used that money to build their fleet even bigger, and if anyone tried to leave the league, Athens would crush them. Sparta watched all this and got more and more nervous. They had their own alliance system called the Peloponnesian League, and they started worrying that Athens was getting too powerful. The thing about big wars is they usually don't start over something big. There's all this tension building up, and then some small thing sets it off. For the Peloponnesian War, that small thing was Epidamnus. Yeah, I know, you've probably never heard of it. It was this tiny city way up north that got into a civil war. One side asked for help from Corcyra, another city. Corcyra said no, so that side asked Corinth instead. Corinth said yes. This pissed off Corcyra, who then went to Athens for help. Now here's why this mattered. Corcyra had the second biggest navy in Greece after Athens. If Corinth, which was allied with Sparta, got control of that navy, the balance of power would shift dramatically. Athens decided to back Corcyra. Then there was another incident involving a city called Potidaea. Things escalated quickly. Sparta's allies, especially Corinth, started screaming that Athens was out of control and needed to be stopped. Sparta held an assembly, and after a lot of debate, they voted for war. The Spartans sent an ultimatum to Athens: back off and give the Greek cities their autonomy. Athens, led by a guy named Pericles, basically said, make us. And just like that, the war was on. The first phase of this war is called the Archidamian War, named after the Spartan king Archidamus. It lasted for about 10 years, and the strategy on both sides was interesting. Pericles had a plan for Athens. He knew they couldn't beat Sparta in a land battle. Nobody could. So his strategy was simple. Everyone retreat behind Athens' walls, let the Spartans trash the countryside, and Athens would use its navy to raid Spartan territory and maintain their empire. Athens had these massive walls called the Long Walls that connected the city to its port at Piraeus, so they could get supplies by sea indefinitely. It was basically a waiting game. The Spartans marched into Athenian territory and started burning farms and olive groves, expecting the Athenians to come out and fight. But the Athenians just stayed behind their walls and watched. Can you imagine how frustrating that must have been for both sides? The Spartans are destroying everything you owned, and you're just supposed to sit there. Then disaster struck. With everyone crowded inside the walls, disease broke out. We call it the Plague of Athens, though it probably wasn't actual plague. Nobody knows exactly what it was, but it was horrific. People died by the thousands. Bodies piled up in the streets. The social order broke down. People stopped caring about laws or religion because they figured they'd be dead soon anyway. And here's the worst part: Pericles himself caught it and died. The guy who'd basically been running Athens for decades, the strategic genius, gone. Athens would never really find another leader as capable as him. Despite the plague the war ground on, there were battles, raids, small victories, and defeats on both sides. Sparta even tried to build a fleet to challenge Athens at sea, with Persian money helping them out. Nothing really decisive happened for years. Both sides were exhausted, and in 421 BC, they agreed to a peace treaty called the Peace of Nicias. So they signed this treaty that was supposed to last 50 years. Spoiler alert, it lasted about 6. The problem was that neither side really committed to peace. Athens kept messing around with Sparta's allies. Small conflicts kept breaking out. The treaty said everyone would return captured territory, but that didn't really happen. It was less a real peace and more a timeout where everyone caught their breath. During this period, Athens started getting ambitious again. A politician named Alcibiades came to prominence. This guy was wealthy, brilliant, charming, and absolutely reckless. He was like if you took someone's natural political talent and removed any sense of caution or loyalty, he'd play a huge role in what came next. Meanwhile, cities in Sicily were asking Athens for help against Syracuse, the dominant power on the island. Some Athenians saw an opportunity. If they could conquer Sicily, they'd control the grain trade, have unlimited resources, and maybe even move on to Carthage in North Africa. They could become unstoppable. It was an insane idea, but Athens decided to go for it. In 415 BC, Athens launched the Sicilian Expedition, and honestly, it's one of the greatest military disasters in history. They sent a massive fleet, over 100 ships and thousands of soldiers. This was a huge chunk of Athens' military power, sent across the Mediterranean to conquer an island. Alcibiades was one of the commanders, but before they even got there, he was recalled to Athens on charges of religious vandalism. Instead of going back to face trial, he defected to Sparta. Yeah, he just switched sides. The Athenian forces besieged Syracuse, but they couldn't quite take it. The Syracusans called for help, and Sparta sent a brilliant general named Gylippus. He turned the whole situation around. The besiegers became the besieged. The Athenian commander, Nicias, kept sending messages back home saying they needed reinforcements or should retreat. Athens sent reinforcements, which just meant more men trapped in Sicily. Nicias, who was sick and had never wanted this expedition in the first place, couldn't make the hard decision to leave. Finally, they tried to escape. The Syracusans trapped their fleet in the harbor and destroyed it. The Athenian army tried to march inland but got hunted down. Thousands were killed. The survivors were thrown into stone quarries where most of them died from exposure and starvation. The commanders, including Nicias, were executed. Athens had just lost a huge portion of its military, its treasury was empty, and now everyone in the Greek world knew they were vulnerable. The final phase of the war, sometimes called the Ionian War, was Athens' slow death spiral. Sparta, with Persian money, finally built a real navy. They started attacking Athens' empire in the eastern Aegean. Cities that Athens had controlled for decades saw their chance and revolted. Athens' tribute dried up. But here's the crazy thing, Athens kept fighting. They scraped together new fleets, won some battles, and refused to surrender. They even melted down gold from statues to fund the war effort. The democracy got replaced briefly by an oligarchy, then the democracy came back. It was chaos, but they kept going. Alcibiades, that defector I mentioned, actually came back to Athens for a while and won some victories for them. Then he fell out of favor again and went into exile for good. The man was loyal to nobody but himself. The end came in 405 BC at a place called Mesopotamia. The Spartan general Lysander caught the Athenian fleet beached on shore and destroyed almost all of it in a surprise attack. Without a fleet, Athens couldn't feed its population. Sparta besieged the city. In 404 BC, Athens surrendered. The long walls were torn down to the sound of flutes. Sparta installed a pro-Spartan oligarchy called the 30 Tyrants, who ruled with terror for about a year before democracy was eventually restored. The war was over. It had lasted 27 years. Thousands were dead. The Greek world was shattered. So what did all this accomplish? Basically nothing good. Sparta won, but they didn't know how to run an empire. Within a generation, they'd become as unpopular as Athens had been. Other Greek cities started challenging them. The whole Greek world was weakened, divided, and exhausted. This created a power vacuum that Philip II of Macedon, and later his son Alexander the Great, would eventually fill. Within a few decades of the war ending, Greece would lose its independence to Macedonia. You could argue that the Greeks essentially destroyed themselves in this war. But there's a reason we still talk about the Peloponnesian War. A historian named Thucydides, who was actually an Athenian general during part of the war, wrote an incredible history of it. His work is considered one of the first serious works of history, and people still read it today. He tried to figure out the deeper causes of the war, how fear and ambition drive nations to conflict, how democracies make decisions in wartime. The war raised questions that we still grapple with. When does a defensive alliance become an empire? How do you balance security with freedom? What happens when two different political systems compete for dominance? Does military power guarantee safety or just breed more conflict? The Peloponnesian War was a tragedy in the classical sense, watching the Greek city-states, which had accomplished so much in art, philosophy, and politics, tear themselves apart over pride, fear, and the inability to compromise. Nobody really won. Greece lost. And maybe that's the real lesson. Sometimes the wars we think we need to fight end up destroying the very things we were trying to protect. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, let me know what other ancient conflicts you'd want me to cover. Until next time.